Thank you, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. So, IT governance, we specialize in pretty well anything to do with governance, risk management, compliance, and above all, information security, the one place you can go for everything you might want to know on any of those subjects. And that's led us to develop a fairly solid understanding, both academic and practical, of security issues in the cloud. And I'm going to start this particular conversation by looking at what the UK public sector definition of information assurance is, because it's a very practical point around which to build what I'm going to say for the next 15 minutes or so. The definition is that information assurance is the confidence that information systems will provide the information that will protect the information they handle and will function as they need to, when they need to, and as expected. In other words, it is about assurance. How do you, as a user of a cloud service or as the provider of a cloud service, gain assurance or give assurance that the service will operate and will deliver the information in a way that is expected? And there are really two basic approaches to how that might happen. One is an audit. As a user of a service, you can audit that it's performing in a way that you expect it to, that its security is of the sort that you might expect. And the second way you could get assurance is to rely on external audit and certification of that service. And of course, for that to happen, there needs to be some form of meaningful external certification or audit scheme. It's no good somebody saying to you, well, we've audited our own services and staggeringly they're superb. What you want is something on which you can rely. And ISO 27001 is the international information security standard which now underpins pretty well everything that in the public and private sectors is done around information security in the United Kingdom. So against that background, just a brief look at the issues of risk and scope, starting with ISO 27001. ISO 27001 is founded on the idea of a risk assessment that in order to determine appropriate controls, management needs to identify the information assets and put in place controls that will secure them to a level of adequacy in terms of its risk appetite. It also says that there needs to be an intelligent method of defining the scope for your information security management system. In other words, you can only really look at putting controls in place for those assets that are within the scope of the ISMS. And of course, cloud computing creates some real challenges for both of those core issues of ISO 27001. When you look at risk assessment, you have a big issue over who owns the assets, where the risks are, and how the risks are going to be managed. And when you look at scope, you have the huge issue of what we mostly call now deperimeterization, the move away from the monolithic fixed network environment in which the security team can secure every single piece of information and asset. One way of looking at risk in the cloud is to look at it in terms of where the risk ownership lives in cloud relationships. And this diagram, which comes out of the recently published Cloud Computing book, there's some details about where you can find it, looks at where the balance is between security, compliance, and risk in cloud applications. And what it's really saying is that where security is concerned, there is a balance. The responsibility is shared. Where compliance is concerned, the responsibility is shared between the cloud provider and the user of the cloud service. But where risk is concerned, it's all with the user of the service. And that's a deliberate approach by cloud organizations. They set out to make sure the whole nature of cloud is that you can take and use what you want to use, but it's your risk, your information, your business, your services. And it's important to understand that that's at the core of, from a client's point of view, how this works, because it helps you think about what you do next. And this diagram is trying to look at how you might extend the scope of your management system, taking into account where what you'd call a trust boundary exists. The trust boundary is the point at which the sharing of responsibility for compliance, for security, and for risk shifts. So For infrastructure as a service, what it's saying is that the trust boundary is a long way to the left. In other words, there is a lot of things which you're depending on yourself to put in place, whereas with application as a service, software as a service, actually the responsibility is much more limited. So if you look at the issue of scoping as the process, whether you're a buyer of services, you extend your scope to the trust boundary. If you're a provider of services, the scope of your own security operation extends to exactly the same trust boundary, to the same point at which responsibility shifts. And so, given that scope can be determined fairly practically for cloud services on the basis of whether you have an infrastructure, a platform, or a service, software as a service set up, the next thing to look at is what type of control frameworks you might draw on. And there are a lot of control frameworks out there. There are the ISO standards, the most common of which are ISO 27001 and 27002. Still sitting in development. I'll touch on later on a 27032 and 036, which are going to be of particular value to the cloud community, both providers of services and their customers. There is the Cloud Controls Matrix, which I'll look at in a bit more detail from the Cloud Security Alliance. There's SSAE 16. A number of you will have come across SAS 70, an audit methodology, which has been replaced with SSAE 16. I'll touch briefly on that. And then, of course, there is PCI DSS. Many of you processing card transactions are already aware of the challenges around scope and controls in dealing with payment card data. And then there is the COBIT, Control Objectives for Information and Communications Technology, version 5 of which was released about 3 or 4 weeks ago. So a number of well-recognized, well-established, widely respected control frameworks, each of which has got slightly different objectives and works in slightly different ways. I'm going to focus really on two of them. The first is ISO 27001. And ISO 27001 is a management system standard. It's a specification, for those of you who don't know it, which sets out how management should go about managing information security. It's not a set of controls. It's a methodology for identifying risk, for selecting appropriate controls, for implementing the controls and ensuring that they're performing in a way that is appropriate and in line with what management looked for. ISO 27001 broken up into a number of areas, the core part of which is the clauses clauses 4 to 8, the management system, and that's supported by a list of controls, what's generally identified as Annex A, as a list of 133 controls, and that's simply a candidate list of controls that an organization might select from if it's implementing an information security management system. ISO 27002 is what's called a code of practice. In other words, it has guidance on how to implement controls. Both of the standards are designed to be technology neutral. They're designed to be agnostic of sector, of supplier. They're meant to work in a best practice format pretty well anywhere in the world. And that's exactly what the guidance of ISO 27002 is doing. It's enabling you to look at the 133 controls in Annex A and determine the most effective way of implementing those controls. Those 133 controls are organized into a number of what you might call domains, covering such obvious areas as policy through HR security, physical environmental security, access, operations, and all the rest. But the critical point about them is that ISO 27001 was published in October 2005. Technology's changed quite a lot, as has the cloud environment. So when you look at the scheme which is built around ISO 27001, you need to bear that in mind. And therefore, a look at the cloud controls matrix is a sensible thing to do. Much more recently developed, the CSA has put together a set of controls that are appropriate for the cloud environment. There are 11 domains of controls that contain some 98 controls, and most helpfully in this matrix, it maps every single one of the identified 98 controls to all of the other frameworks that I've identified, and indeed to ISO 27001. That's the set of domains that the CSA has identified as part of its control matrix, all of which are relevant, depending on which side of the trust boundary you are, to security in the cloud. SSAE 16 is is an audit methodology. It's a standard that sets out how technology audits should be carried out by a CPA. It's how they observe controls in process, how they ensure that they are achieving the objectives that are set, but it's not a control framework. It's simply a methodology for assessing and reporting on controls, and at one level you could choose virtually any control you like. So when a customer is relying on your SSAE 16 certificates, they're not necessarily relying on well-chosen or well-built controls. They're simply relying on the fact that the controls that you say you have in place, you actually do have in place because a CPA has audited them and made a statement to that effect. One sensible way of pulling together the CCM and other control frameworks is through the process of ISO 27001. ISO 27001 says that you should identify all of the controls that are appropriate and create a list of controls that you're going to apply. And you can select your controls not only from the list in Annex A, but from anywhere else. And as this matrix suggests, you could identify in your risk assessment the need to put a control in place to deal with a particular access vulnerability, and it might be something which is a control specified by PCI DSS, and so it will be, as the last column shows, a tick in your statement of applicability. There may be other controls which are there only because PCI requires you to have them there, but whatever it is, you can create a matrix that links together, building out of the CCM matrix, a integrated set of controls that live inside an ISO 27001 environment. And the really important thing about that is it enables you to have an external audit carried out against the control framework. And that's relevant whichever side of the trust divide you live on. If you're a cloud services provider, you want to be able to demonstrate to customers that the controls you put in place are appropriate to the type of service that you provide. And the fact that your statement of applicability is published, it's referenced in the certificate of conformance, enables your customer to identify what controls you actually have in place and to see for themselves that the controls are appropriate. As a user or consumer of cloud services, it enables you in your own ISO 27001 certificate to work out where the weaknesses might be in the controls put in place by your supplier. So you can map very easily using that trust boundary model, map very easily through the CCM and your ISO 27001 matrix where the most important controls need to be. And really the final thing I want to be saying about security in the cloud is that in some ways it's just as easy as security in any other environment. It requires you to know what you're doing. ISO 27001 makes a very strong point about the need for training. There are a growing number of courses which exist around risk assessment and security in the cloud. People who are getting involved in cloud security should be informing themselves about the subject. They should understand how trust boundaries work. They should understand how the cloud controls matrix works. And if nothing else, you should be reading about the subjects. And I've identified there some books inevitably published through our publishing arm, but which are right up to the minute in terms of focusing on security and certification of security in the cloud in a way that works both for customers and for suppliers of services. Which brings me to an end to what I was planning to say. If there is time, I'm happy to take questions from anybody who has any.